Now let's look for some effects beyond the occasional revolution. One study of this period where you had the rise of these pro-democracy NGOs from 1990 to 2003, found that USAID investment in democratization was structured roughly like this. About 40% of the money was spent on civil society, mass media, civic education, those sorts of things. About 26%, or let's say 25%, was spent on governance, decentralization of the state, increasing transparency, anti-corruption programs that were geared towards the non-democratic state, money that went to the non-democratic state. About 1/5 or 20% of the money was spent on rule of law projects, human rights, judicial development, so things that went both to the state and to non-governmental actors. And then about 12% of the money was spent on elections, political processes like electoral assistance, support for political parties. So with hundreds of millions of dollars going to democracy support, what is and isn't working? Is it working at all? Well, the Georgia case suggests that there are at least some partial successes, though we'll come back to that later on in this class when we talk about what happened to Georgia afterwards. The broader empirical evidence suggests that there's been a tiny bit more democratization in the last decade, from 2000 to 2009. But there's more of a neutral record than a bad one. In other words, there's not a growth of non-democracies, but there's almost a stalemate. Still, other studies have found that targeted support, targeted spending can have a significant impact on Freedom House scores. Freedom House is an NGO that measures political and civil rights in particular countries. In particular, looking at the USAID case study from 1990 to 2003, they found that funds for elections and political processes have a significant impact on free and fairness of elections. Again, looking at Freedom House scores. The more money that was spent on elections and political processes, the more likely you would have a better Freedom House score, a more democratic score. Rule of law spending also had significant impact, but it was lagged. In other words, you didn't have the immediate impact. It would take a few years. It was a few years after the spending had begun. Civil society programs had some immediate and some lagged effects, and free media had a lagged effect as well. So all these seem to have some effect. The authors claim here that, quote, an investment of $1 million, measured in $2,000, would foster an increase in democracy 65% greater than the change expected for the average country in the sample in any given year. In other words, there's some large N data that supports that more money going towards democracy assistance is actually having an impact in some degree of democratization. Now, an interesting point here is the finding that human rights spending is actually associated with a strong negative effect on democracy. And this brings up some important methodological questions that are important to consider. And maybe I'll throw these out in a discussion question. I won't get into these right now. But there's an even bigger methodological question here. It's hard to measure counterfactuals. What would have happened if we didn't put the money into this? Maybe a worsening of the democracy record on the planet in the whole? So maybe we would have had more and more non-democracies. Maybe democracy spending is doing something. Or maybe we would have had the same sort of process that we see today. Although the USAID study suggests that that's not the case. Now, what's indisputable is the fact that non-democracies remain strong, and they outnumber democracies. According to Carruthers, there are 4 basic accounts, and these are my labels here, for the continued strength of non-democracies, non-democrats in much of the world. One is cultural. Think of political culture. Much of the post-communist world, the former Soviet Union in particular, and Asia, where the opposition is seen as a national threat that weakens the state, where many people feel that they need a strong state and not these dangerous civil liberties that can lead to too much turmoil. Another account is crumbs in the Middle East in particular. In particular, we look at what we call defensive liberalization. So you've got top-down liberalization led by the non-democratic incumbents who implement tiny reforms to make the state economically more efficient and keep people more satisfied with the incumbents, or at least less likely to explode. It's a sort of safety valve of sorts. What they're doing is just like what Marx said they were doing. They're providing for these crumbs to the people so that they can see that there's a little bit of progress. A third argument is this abyss one. There's this vicious circle, in particular in many states in Africa, where you have personalistic, unstable political parties, weak rule of law, high levels of corruption, poorly functioning legislatures, which in turn promote more and more of the same. In other words, people get pulled into a system with little light at the end of the tunnel. This abyss, you've got this constant circle of these awful leaders. And people don't see any alternative. And remember, for all these color revolutions, there was an alternative. There was a clear alternative. Finally, the last account here is populism. In places like Central and South America, Central Europe, many have chosen less democratic options as a result of inequality. So it's not just the poor economic performance of democracies. Recall that populism, nationalism, and the risk of democratic failure are all bound together. Populism is frequently associated with nationalism, and nationalism is associated with democratization's failure.